Well, thanks very much. Thanks especially to the co-sponsors, the American Federation of Teachers, and especially to Leo Casey, I don't see him in this room, for the invitation to participate in today's forum and to speak about the topic of precarious employment in liberal market economies, lessons for the U.S. post-secondary education sector. I'm very pleased to be here today. And in fact, preparing for today's event offered me an opportunity to reflect on some work I've been doing for quite a while now on the nature and shape of precarious employment in the last 2 decades, with particular attention to a sector that's very near and dear to me as a university professor, that of post-secondary education. So I therefore am going to use my time today to address a couple of questions. First, I want to look at what we need to know about the nature and extent of precarious employment and its drivers in liberal market economies, or LMEs, to understand its shape in post-secondary education in the US. Second, I want to look at the question of what are the most promising principles and policy options to base our proposals for improving job quality in this sector on. And in addressing these questions, I want to advocate for an understanding of precarious employment that moves beyond, and this has already come up this morning, an association with particular forms of employment to address dimensions of labor market insecurity and workers' social location, so race and gender and such, and social context, industry, occupation. In fact, I want to suggest that the forms precarious employment takes within the U.S. post-secondary education sector resemble those in Canada, the US, the EU 15 and Australia. And I want to suggest that even though the contours of precarious employment in the US as a whole reflect what I have called, and I will explain, is what I would call a degraded standard employment relationship model, those in post-secondary education reflect a tiered, what I'll call a tiered SER model, which looks a lot like other liberal market economies. So we therefore learn a great deal about the challenges facing post-secondary educators in the US by looking at the experience of other contexts. So I'll just proceed in 4 parts. First, I'll quickly outline a couple of core concepts. Second, I'll sketch the contours of precarious employment in several LMEs and highlight the significant differences between a group I'll call the rest, that is Canada, the EU 15 and Australia, and a grouping and the US. And third, I'll offer my impressions on the nature of precarious employment in US post-secondary education from what I've read and heard. And fourth, I'll talk about a few principles, introduce a few principles that might be applied to thinking about how to improve the quality of work therein. So I want to start by defining a couple of concepts. And I want to do so not because these concepts will be new to you, quite the opposite. In fact, I assume they will be familiar, and familiarity tends to breed misunderstanding when we use the same labels to describe quite different phenomena. Indeed, one of the leading premises of my own research is that a conceptual slippage pervades efforts to describe precarious employment. And this slippage clouds understandings of its contours and in a certain way impedes attempts to mitigate the problem. So in particular, even though they are related terms, precarious and non-standard, and Randy alluded to this earlier, not in these terms, but are not synonymous. So to begin with my foremost concept, precarious employment, I define precarious employment as forms of work for remuneration that are characterized by dimensions of labor market insecurity. So uncertainty, a lack of control, limited benefits, low wages, and shaped by workers' social location, so gender, race, and other axes of social disadvantage, and social context, so industry, geography, and such. So one cannot understand precarious employment, however, I would argue, without reference to another concept, the standard employment relationship, or what I talk about as the SER in what follows, which I take to be a kind of normative model of employment that we associate with full-time continuous employment, where the worker has one employer, works under direct supervision, and has access to a social wage. And in some of my work, I demonstrate that the standard employment relationship is intertwined historically with a particular what I call a gender contract based on a lot of feminist research, which I take to encompass the social, legal, and political practices that surround exchanges between breadwinning and caregiving. And I suggest that when this standard employment relationship, or SER, was at its height, there was an assumption that it was a male breadwinner, female caregiver contract. And then I also take the standard employment relationship to rest upon a particular understanding of citizenship that assumes a correspondence between membership and territory. So at the height of the standard employment relationship in the LMEs I'm talking about today, this meant, and I guess continues to mean, nationally based employment and immigration laws and policies, often racialized in their effects, that provide for open-ended employment relationships among citizens in a country in which they work, while limiting many non-nationals to temporary engagements. So why are these concepts important? Why define them with precision? The reason I would argue is that across liberal market economies, the standard employment relationship together with these associated concepts has been dominant. And it served as a reference point, therefore, in identifying dimensions of labor market insecurity. At the same time, despite its normative preeminence, in practice, the means through which the standard employment relationship has been institutionalized has differed in these countries and regions. And this variation has affected the shape of the standard employment relationship and also the forms that precarious employment takes. So broadly speaking, in Canada, the US, the EU, 15, and Australia, labor laws and policies have institutionalized central pillars of the standard employment relationship with the backing of collective bargaining. In contrast, in the US, collective bargaining, as has been emphasized, has been extremely pivotal, backed by certain legislative protections. And these different processes and mechanisms have meant that the form of the standard employment relationship in the US has been full-time, ongoing, emphasize the ongoing, employment in a unionized domain. In contrast, in the rest, it's taken the form of full-time, permanent employment. So if we shift now to talk about the different contours of precarious employment in these contexts, interestingly, as this slide shows, the SER took as this slide shows, in the US, full-time employment has been stable for about 3 decades. So standing between 70 and 72% of total employment between 1985 and 2015. Yet in this period, as has already been emphasized this morning, in the US, we've seen mounting significance of employment at will and declining union membership, the stagnation of wages and the high prevalence of low-wage work, and also deficiencies in employer-provided social wage benefits. Hence my reference to a degraded SER model in much of the US as a whole, where full-time ongoing employment, much of it, is precarious. In contrast, as this slide shows, in Canada, the EU 15 and Australia, we've endured the decline of full-time permanent employment. So for example, in the EU 15 in the late 80s, full-time permanent employment represented over 2/3 of total employment, yet it currently constitutes about 57%. Conversely, in liberal market economies of this sort, forms of employment that have become more sizable differ a lot from this norm. Hence my reference to a tiered standard employment relationship model. To give you an example of what this means, as this slide shows, whereas in 1989, temporary employment represented just under 6% and 5% of total employment. In Canada and the European Union 15, it constituted well over 11% of total employment in each of these contexts in 2015. And then when we look at Canada and we break down the category of temporary employment, we also see that those types of temporary employment that are most identified with precariousness are gendered female. Whereas men are the majority of those temporary employees in seasonal employment, which in Canada is better protected, women predominate in casual employment characterized by high levels of insecurity, much of which is part-time. And to bring in the Australian case, we see that in Australia, there's been a dramatic rise in part-time employment, as elsewhere, but particularly dramatic in Australia. And this slide shows that it's gone from 18% in 1985 to 31% in 2015. And women are those that predominate in it most. But what makes part-time employment unique in Australia and very highly precarious is that 50%, fully 50%, is casual, which is a designation that effectively provides people with casual loadings instead of social benefits and various protections that are extended to permanent employees. So why this overview? Well, the reason for this overview is, and the point I want to emphasize, is that in LMEs outside the US, we see the following pattern. The greater the deviation from this standard employment relationship model, the deeper the precariousness, which I identify with this tiered SER model. Now, when I turn to the situation of post-secondary educators in the US, one which I want to suggest that it reflects this tiered SER model. So, as many in this audience obviously will be aware, and given what you've heard this morning, over the past several decades in the US, there's been a dramatic increase in the share of faculty that you describe in the US, a term that I don't love, but we can talk about that in the question period, that you describe as contingent, a term that you use to describe educators who are neither employed in tenure nor tenure-track positions, namely full-time faculty on limited-term contracts and so-called part-time faculty who are often paid by the course. So indeed, more and more employment in this country's post-secondary education sector resembles that in LMEs. More specifically, the situation of contingent faculty is akin to that of fixed-term temporary employees in Canada and the EU15 and part-time casuals in Australia. So as this graph shows, non-tenure track faculty full-time faculty positions increased by 62% between 1975 and 2014, my source here being the AAUP. The growth of part-time faculty over the past 4 decades has been even more pronounced, increasing by 70%. And furthermore, as the association reports, on average, part-time faculty members' earnings per institution last year were $16,718. So the growth of contingent faculty, I would also suggest, is a gendered phenomenon. It affects everybody, of course, but based on 2011 figures, we see that if we look in particular at part-time faculty, typically the most poorly remunerated group of contingent faculty, a larger share of women than men hold part-time positions. This situation closely resembles that subset of temporary employees in Canada that are casual, much of which is part-time. And it also mirrors the subset of employees in Australia that is casual. So in these ways, the shape of contingent work in US post-secondary education resembles that of precarious employment under this, what I talk about as a tiered SER model. So in considering how to respond to precarious employment in LMEs that reflect this tiered model, in my work, I have advanced, together with colleagues, the principles of parity, which I've worked on with Judy Fudge, and inclusivity, which I write about in my book, Managing the Margins. I've advanced these 2 principles. And by parity, I mean crafting protections attentive to the diverse needs and situations of workers in different forms of employment, rather than prorating things to the elusive, as I've shown you, comparator of this full-time permanent employee. And by inclusivity, I mean providing pathways of entry into the community of workers covered by and able to access a full range of employment and labor protections. So in the case of post-secondary educators in the US, Applying these principles might entail, on the one hand, strengthening tenure through more direct lines to this status. But on the other hand, it also calls for increasing certainty and security among contingent faculty, including via greater opportunities for what we call in Canada, conversion to the tenure stream or conversion to a more secure stream. And important here and under development in some Canadian universities are on-the-ground efforts to address the situation of contingent faculty. And I want to tell you about one example. It actually comes from my university, York University in Toronto, and it's known as the conversion program. This program allows part-time faculty members who have 5 years of high-intensity teaching, which is quite common, looking at the numbers in the US, to be placed in a priority pool of candidates from which they are eligible for appointment to either standard tenure track positions or what we call alternate stream teaching positions. York's conversion program is by no means a panacea. We have relatively small numbers of conversion appointments annually. But the principles behind it are really important. It does provide a means of recognizing, in this case through a collective agreement, but perhaps this could happen through other means, and here I quote the agreement, the substantial contribution to the university community made by long-term employees and of the obstacles that they have faced in their attempts to find academic employment. The modest successes of this program relate partly to the higher rates of unionization in universities than in Canada. Indeed, based on 2008 figures, which I have taken from Dobby and Robson, it seems to me that in 2008, fully 80% of faculty are covered, not necessarily organized under, but covered by a collective agreement in Canada to about 26% in the US. So in conclusion, given the close resemblances between the contours of precarious employment within US post-secondary education and those in Canada, the EU and 15, and Australia, it seems to me to make sense to look beyond the US border to examine promising approaches to its mitigation among contingent faculty elsewhere. And as a first step to realizing what I've talked about as parity and inclusivity among contingent faculty, it seems like developments in these LMEs highlight the importance of creating accessible modes of representation, and that seems to me what the next panel is focused on, for post-secondary educators, ideally routes to unionization, but other routes along the way, presumably, regardless of the form of employment in which they are engaged. Of course, creating routes to unionization is especially critical in the US because of the nature of at-will employment and because, as I mentioned, of how your version of the standard employment relationship was institutionalized. And of course, optimally, and this really I think can't be stressed enough, is that tenure and tenure-track faculty in the case of post-secondary education, or more secure teachers in the case of primary education and secondary education, that are concerned to sustain an investment in permanency, or in this case, tenured position, should in turn embrace these models of representation for their contingent colleagues, because they share a struggle against a degraded SER. And of course, the associated gender inequalities, inequalities on the basis of race, et cetera, that are associated with this degraded SER model. So that's my message to you from Canada and a little bit of elsewhere for today. Thanks.
Leah, thank you. Leah, thank you. And I hope that while we are hearing the presentations, that we're taking down our questions so that we can have a lively discussion. Next, we want to hear from Arnie Kallenberg.